My name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors and partners here at Green Hills. And if you've got a copy of the scriptures, please turn with me to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. We've been studying this incredible book about what it looks like to be somebody who is on mission with Christ in a world that is not necessarily for the name and renown of Jesus Christ. And so this has been an incredible study for us. We got one more week left. But as we start looking towards this week, I'm reminded about how important it is to be somebody who is salt and light in the community that you are sent into. Today is an amazing day. We actually get to celebrate 500 years of the Reformation. So 500 years ago, a man named Martin Luther ignited a movement where people started studying the scriptures again in a very personal and powerful way. And the reason we're here today in this room today is because Martin Luther had the courage to be somebody who is countercultural. Someone who said, listen, the gospel is central. It is necessary. We must be people who live by faith and live according to the scriptures. And those two tenets have transformed Christianity back to its original purpose. I'm also reminded today about something that's deeply troubling, which is the rise of racism in our country. And, you know, one of the things that's important for us as a community, as a faith community in the city, is just to continue to remember some of the things that are central to us as a gospel community. You see, Green Hills Church exists to be a place that calls people back to God, a place that all nations and all races can coexist together in gospel unity. That's important to us because we believe this is something that God cares about. In fact, when you look at the end of the story that is revealed in the scriptures, in heaven, someday there's going to be a worship service that just blows the roof off of anything you've ever experienced here on the earth. A place where all nations, tribes, and tongues gather together underneath the name of one person, which is Jesus Christ, proclaiming that he alone is worthy and that the gospel has drawn us all together into that, right? And so we believe as a community, we get to experience that now. One of the things I love about Green Hills is that we have the nations gathered among us. Like, you may look around and be like, is that really true? Like, how's that even possible? Like, it just seems like there's a lot of people just like me here. And yet, when you start meeting the people at Green Hills Church, you find that almost every state in our nation is represented, as well as almost 24 nationalities, which is crazy, right? And part of that is because God is gathering to himself a people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so when you hear stories of marches being planned where people are starting to say, you know what, we want to just create a nation without people that are different than us. That's grievous to the gospel, and it's grievous to us as well. And so one of the things I think is so beautiful about our church is we get to be a community where we get to be a showroom of what future grace looks like, living in it now, where people get to see us walking in unity and harmony as a community that's very diverse. And we want to see even more of that progressing in our community. And the only way that is possible is if the gospel permeates our heart and we're able to pass it on to others. That's what it means to be a counterculture, to be a group of people who are saying, listen, we live for a different reality and a different future, a place where Christ, the future king, will exert his rule and reign over all of us so we can be one, regardless of our background, regardless of our upbringing, regardless of what language we speak, regardless of what culture we come from, that Jesus Christ is the central figure in our life. And Christ is teaching us how to do that through the experience of being in a community of faith like this one. Now, in this text today, in Daniel chapter 6, we're going to find some ground rules on how to do that well. See, sometimes I talk like that, and people are like, so how do you do that? Like, literally, I want in on that, but how do I do that? Like, how do I share the future hope that I have? How do I share my hope in Christ with my friends, with the community? Do I just like hope that they get it by me just being a friend to them? Like, do I just like be a really good person and be a cool enough Christian that at some point they're going to be like, yeah, I just want what you have. Like, I just want that. In fact, I've found a lot of people trying to do that, and what I've found over and over again is that just never works. There's something more than just being a cool Christian, right? I don't know if anybody really has been like, you're such a cool Christian, I want to be one too. That this doesn't really happen. So how do we do that in a way that is powerful, that changes our community? How does it transform our world and our life and the way that we live, so much so that the gospel passes from one person to the next? Like, how do we do that well? So we're going to look through that in the life of Daniel as he lives out a counterculture in his community. So we're going to start in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 6. Words on the screen. If you want to look at the hard copy, there's a Bible at the end of each one of these rows. You're welcome to grab one of those and follow along with me. Now it says this: it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps because of an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now we're going to stop right there because it's a good place for us to kind of set some groundwork as to what's going on in the story. So some of you guys have been tracking with us and you have been reading through the book of Daniel, and you may be wondering some things that are important about this text. You may be wondering, like, hey, who's this guy Darius? Like, we've been talking about Nebuchadnezzar a lot. Who's this guy Darius who's now the king? Like, where did he come into this story? I know Daniel, but who's Darius? That's a great question to ask. Last week we saw that Daniel saw a regime change. Nebuchadnezzar has died. His grandchildren took over. And in a stroke of incredible transition, the Medes and the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And now there's a new king. His name is Xerxes. I'm sorry, Cyrus. Xerxes comes later. His name is Cyrus. And he's actually appointed this guy named Darius to rule over the province of Babylon. So Darius is a ruler, and he's organizing his nation, his new regime, underneath the rule of Cyrus, and he's placing people in charge of it. This is what we find here. He's appointing satraps, which is a fancy word for a governor or a leader, and he's putting these presidents over them. And Daniel's one of those guys. Now, we also may be wondering, like, where are all Daniel's friends, right? There's 3 other guys that we mentioned earlier in the text, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Where are those guys? Like, where are they in the rest of the story? They've kind of been invisible for a while. It's probably because they're dead. I hate to break it to you, but a lot of time has gone by, and Daniel seems to have lived all of his friends. Often, when you see this story, you may think of Daniel as a young man, right? Maybe you kind of put yourself in Daniel's place. So whatever age you are, you think Daniel is. This is a common thing that I find myself doing. But at this time, Daniel's actually very old. He's probably over 80. Okay, so he's an old man. And we find him changing his nation, even though he's very advanced in age. So it doesn't matter what age you are, whether you're young or old, you can be somebody who changes the society that you live in. Sometimes we think like, hey, listen, I'm disqualified because of my age or my status or what I bring to the table. Daniel's a great testimony that you don't have to be a certain age or a certain level of strength. It's really Christ who does that in you. And here's the first thing we find if you want to be somebody who allows the gospel to transfer from your life to somebody else's. If you want to be somebody who shares your hope in Christ, which is the most important thing that you have, to other people, how do you share that with your friends? The first thing is to be an excellent citizen in the world. That's the first thing we're going to find here, is that this is something you find about Daniel over and over again in the scriptures. Every chapter in the book of Daniel, you'll find this repeated about him, is that he's an excellent citizen. In fact, here you find him being promoted over everybody else because of this excellent spirit that's in him. He's somebody that's really good at his job. And sometimes we skip over this part as Christians. We just think that being a Christian is only a physical reality in our local church, perhaps. We kind of mostly put our Christianity in our spiritual experiences. Like me and God, me and my walk with other Christians, me and my friends, me and my kids, but we don't really like to extend that into our workplace. But Daniel teaches us that if you want to be somebody who's a witness in your community, the way that you work, the way that you spend time with your coworkers, the way that you interact with other people really matters. Daniel gains a platform with his friends and his community in the way that he interacts with everybody else. And the king wants to elevate him. He gets great traction because of his work ethic and the way he interacts with his coworkers. And the reason he's able to do this is because Daniel is somebody who understands where his true identity is. It's not just here in his workplace or even in his world, but it's in his future destiny in God. See, he's got a different kind of hope, which allows him to be free to be somebody who lives differently than everybody else. C.S. Lewis says this about Christians who make a difference in the world. said this, if you read history, you'll find that Christians who did the most for the present world were precisely those who thought the most of the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. What C.S. Lewis is pointing to is he's saying, listen, Christians are able to be truly themselves and truly free when they think about what their future hope is rather than just their current realities. It frees them up to be people who take incredible risks for the gospel because they're able to live in a way that is not just mostly about self-preservation and trying to make sure that you move your own name and your own story forward. So what Daniel does is he actually shows what this looks like by the way that he lives his life. Now, this does not come without opposition. So we find next that he actually has some enemies. Verse 4. Then the presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then the men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So Daniel is spotless. He's an incredible man. He's somebody who's holy, and he doesn't cut corners. He doesn't accept bribes. He has no wrongdoing in his life. And so these enemies who don't want Daniel to be set above them, who are just jealous of the way he's living his life, they try to find something against him, but they can't find anything. The only thing they can find is that he's somebody who's deeply religious, and he has got a different God that he follows. So they decide to kind of find something there to trip Daniel up in. Now, verse 6 says, then these presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of King Darius, the kingdom, the prefects, and the satraps, the counselors and governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So these men who are pretty smart and cunning, they're wicked in their intelligence and the way that they go about this, but they come to the king and say, hey, king, here's what we want you to do. We want you to sign a rule saying that people should only worship you. Now, that sounds crazy, right? Like, who would ever say yes to that? That for 30 days, it's like, yeah, all the worship goes to me. Like, that just seems like completely a huge step outside of reality for all of us, right? Like, we'd never assume anybody would do that for us, or we expect people to like worship us. But in this setting, this is not something that was unheard of. In fact, this seems to be something that is in line with a king trying to consolidate his power. Remember I told you Darius just took over, and he's leading a group of people who really had not had any kind of loyalty to him before. So what he's doing is he's enforcing this rule of law so that people get in line, so you can see who's really not going to be following the king. And so he's doing this to create unity within the government and unity within the nation. And so he accepts to it. There's this one small caveat, is once he puts something in the law, it can't be changed. And so he says, okay, yeah, that sounds great, not realizing that there are going to be implications for some of the people who follow him, particularly Daniel. And the rule basically goes like this. If you worship anyone or anything other than the king for 30 days, then your life is forfeit, and they're going to throw you into a den of lions, which I guess was their version of capital punishment. It's pretty gruesome, honestly, right? So you find Daniel having to face this. Now, one of the things that you hear Daniel doing in this moment is something that most of us would probably not do. So Daniel is faced with this, and he responds. Let's look at what he does here. Verse 10 it says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Now, I think this is an important part for us to just pause on, because this is an important reality about who Daniel is and what he is all about. See, Daniel has made a choice to make Christ or God central in his life. And he does this by a discipline of prayer. So what Daniel does every day is that he goes to his upper room in his place where he lives, and he goes and he prays to Jerusalem. Now, he's not doing that because he thinks Jerusalem's like a special place in a way that it's like, man, this place is what's going to save me. But it's a way for him to remember the worship of God and look back at the place that God had instituted his temple. And he does this every day, 3 times a day, because he is making himself remember who's really the one who's most important in his life. He's trying to remember what's most critical and crucial for him to be somebody who follows God. And so he's got this pattern of praying openly to God 3 times a day. And here we find something that's important when it comes to our sharing our faith and our hope with other people. We need to be people who choose to have spiritual disciplines that anchor our heart to God. So you can't share what God has done in your life if your heart's not fettered or anchored to God. And Daniel has chosen to have certain disciplines, which is, in this case, his prayer to God, so that his heart will not wander and fixate itself on other things. Daniel has realized the value of setting himself into certain disciplines that keep him faithful. See, a lot of times we don't like to think about disciplines, right? Like, in fact, most of us struggle with physical and spiritual disciplines. That's why the gym is so full January 1st, right? Everybody remembers all the disciplines that they wanted to have the year before. They're like, oh yeah, I wanted to lose a certain amount of weight. Oh yeah, I said I was going to go to the gym every day. And so people who regularly go to the gym actually take a time off because they're like, I can't get on any of the machines because everybody's here for a month and they're going to be gone, right? And this is the way we are with our spiritual realities as well. Like, we get really disciplined for a little while when we really need God. When somebody we love is sick, or somebody that we know needs a prayer answered, or we're really going through a hard time, we kind of get ourselves on the spiritual bandwagon of prayer. We start like going to church, and then when things start getting good again, we just like fall off. But Daniel is somebody who set himself certain disciplines because he knows that he needs them because he's living as an exile. He has this reality that he's living among people that don't share the same faith that he does. And if he's not careful, he's going to start looking like the culture, and he's just going to be a slow drift away from God. I think one of the hardest things for American Christians is that we sometimes forget that we are exiles. Because there's enough of us around that are followers of Jesus that we can pretend that we're living in a Christian like reality. But if we start like really looking around us, we see the need around us and the people around us who don't know Jesus, our hearts all of a sudden realize this reality that we've been placed in a place for the name and renown of Jesus. And if we want to be people who are passionate for the name and renown of Jesus, we must put disciplines in our lives to keep us connected to the heart of God. So here's something that I want to propose to you. Lifeway Research came up with a couple of things that they found that were critical for spiritual transformation. They did this big study. So they went and like interviewed lots of Christians and lots of churches, and they started trying to boil down like what disciples people to be passionate for Jesus and grow in their spiritual faith. And honestly, their results were astounding. You know why they were astounding? Because they were so obvious. You know what they found was the number one thing that would help someone grow in their spiritual journey. You know what the number one thing was? Reading your Bible every day. If you read your Bible every day, chances were likely that you would grow in your spiritual walk, which is basically like have a quiet time daily. That will change your life. I know personally it's easier to say that than actually to do that. Like, for me as a dad, like I have to beat my kids, like not beat them, like it sounds terrible. I was going to stop right there. I got to like anticipate their arrival. Let's just say that way, right? I've got to actually like get up before them. So I've got to beat them in the race of waking up. Is that better, right? So that happens like this morning. It was like 4:30, right? Like how's that even possible? So I have to find disciplines in my life where I spend time with Jesus, or it's going to slide away from me. But I know that if I don't spend time every day in the scriptures, my heart quickly runs and attaches itself to other things. The other thing that Lifeway Research found, the second most important thing, was going to church every week. You know, and I think that's interesting because our culture has changed so much. Like, our parents used to go to church, like, not just one time a week or one time every other week or once a month like some of us do. They would go Sunday morning, not just for 1 hour. They would go for a Sunday school hour before church. Then they would come back at 6. Then they would go to something else on Tuesday called visitation, and then come back on Wednesday for a potluck, right? Like they just kind of lived at church. Like most of us, like we're like, man, you're lucky if I'm there, and I've been there like 2 weeks in a row, right? And I understand what that looks like. Honestly, like if I didn't have to be here on Sunday mornings, I could easily find other reasons to go do other things other than come to church. But here's what I know is so important as a Christian, is that when I'm with other Christians and I gather together and worship, my heart becomes alive towards the things of God. When I start slipping in my church attendance, my relationship with God also starts to slip. And I'm also depriving the people around me from experiencing my walk with Christ. See, here's the thing. It's like when you go to church, it's both for you, which is awesome, but it's also for others. When you go to church, you're not just like going just so you get your tank recharged. You're also going to church because you can testify about the goodness of God with other people. There may be people who are walking in the door, who are sitting down next to you, who are running on empty, and Christ has sent you to sit next to them so that they can experience the goodness of God and the grace that God offers through the friendship of a believer who may just believe the gospel for them in a way that is necessary. I just want to brag on my wife here. I don't do that probably enough. But there was one Sunday she said, I was just struggling. The kids were crazy. I came to church, slipped in the back, and God had me there because the person sitting next to me was going through the worst week of their life. And I got to talk to them, and I got to change the trajectory of their story because Jesus sent me to them. That's a different way of looking at going to church, right? You're like, and I'm not just going for me, I'm going for me, but also those who are there with me. And so I would encourage you to re-examine those two things, to say, listen, do I need to re-engage in my daily walk with Christ, reading the scriptures every day? If you want to learn how to do that better, we're actually going to be pushing you towards that in our Advent series. We're going to be kind of having you some daily things you can do together as a family or yourself as you anticipate Christmas. But I would just say this, if you wanted to get started right now towards being somebody who reads the scriptures every day, just pick a book of the Bible you're interested in and just read a chapter a day. It's like really simple. Like, I've never read the book of Philippians. I'm just going to just start reading that. And I'm interested in the book of Revelation. That seems really cool. I'll just start reading it. And if you're confused with that one, just come talk to me later, because that's like crazy stuff in that book, okay? Now, here's what I find too, is that choosing to be a part of a community of faith is hard. It's not easy to be part of a community of faith. It's choosing to give up some of your rights to be in a community, but it's also really, really valuable. When you're with the other people, when you choose to walk with other Christians, you get to make a difference beyond just your own little scope. So like last week, we had a young man come to church, and it was incredible to see him, as he's been somebody who's been running from God, get just surrounded by some other guys who didn't surround him, like intimidate him, but they surrounded him in love. They just kind of got to know him, met him, heard his story, invited him into their community because he was desperately looking for that. When you're part of a church, you're able to be part of something more than just yourself. And so if you want to be a part of that, we're actually having an opportunity for you to join this church as a partner. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a partnership class where you can say, I want to be a part of the vision, and I want to partner with Green Hills Church so that Christ can reach the city for the gospel. Now, the third thing you find Daniel doing as he walks through this is that he becomes somebody who is purposeful in his relationships. So if you want to be somebody who's a gospel influence in your community to share the hope that you have to everybody around you, not only are you called to be somebody who's an excellent citizen, not only are you to be somebody who chooses to have spiritual disciplines in your life, but you also need to be somebody who develops purposeful gospel friendships. Let me say that again. We need to develop purposeful gospel friendships. So you find that here in this story. Verse 11 says, then after Daniel goes and prays, he gets busted. It says, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said, before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, this thing stands fast according to the law of Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. So they go to the king and say, didn't you do this? He said, yes. Verse 13 says, then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction you have signed, but makes this petition 3 times a day. So they're like, hey, we're just going to like spring the trap. It's Daniel. He's the one who's breaking the rules. And he now deserves to die. And here you find the king doing something that's actually surprising. Verse 14 says, then the king, when he had heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored until the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed. The king becomes distressed for Daniel. And he starts trying to change the rules so he can save Daniel. Why? Is it because Daniel's just useful to him? No. It's because Daniel's become his friend. Daniel has chosen to enter into a friendship with this king, this man who's not a follower of God, and they have become friends. And so Daniel now has the king's heart. And the king wants to save Daniel because of the friendship they have. This is something that goes beyond just work relationships. This is something that's deeper. See, every single one of us is built for relationship, and we want friends. And this king had found a friend in Daniel, and Daniel did this because he saw himself as somebody who was sent. We find this over and over again, not just in this text, but throughout the rest of the book of Daniel, that Daniel continues to see himself as someone who testifies to his leadership and to everybody around him that there's one king, but he does so in a way that is just incredibly engaging and is personal. And this king has become Daniel's friend, but there's no way out. Daniel is doomed. By the law that's around him, he must go to the den of lions. So verse 16, we find the king sending him there. It says this, then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And the stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. And then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. The king is incredibly distraught. But you know something that's so fascinating about what's going on here in this text is that the king takes a big step from being somebody who is skeptical about Daniel and his God to being somebody who starts to believe with him. Do you see that? He starts saying, Daniel, may your God that you serve so faithfully preserve you. He doesn't say, my gods, the gods of Babylon, that they preserve you. He says, may your God, Daniel, preserve you. And then he fasts all night. He doesn't have any kind of distractions that night. He's distraught, and he seems to be praying as he's fasting that Daniel will be delivered. He begins to have faith because of his relationship with Daniel. And I think this is important for us because Christ has sent us into our communities so that we can introduce other people to God. That's what Daniel has done here, right? His friend had no relationship with God until Daniel came into his life. And then he begins to pray to this God that he does not know. Why? Because Daniel has allowed the friendship to be a bridge that the gospel can cross into his life. See, that's the beautiful thing about friendships. And what we've seen in history is that when the gospel crosses over the bridge of friendship, it finds fertile ground in the heart of those who are friends with other Christians. When you allow that to happen, people get changed. This is what Paul did when he started churches throughout the Roman world. He'd come into a town, he'd share the gospel with whoever was willing. Those who would hear would accept the gospel. And then Paul would just basically share the gospel with all their friends and their friendship networks, with their families, with their relationships. Why? Because the gospel crosses over the bridge of trust of a relationship. So this is something I want you to consider. When you are living in your workplace, just make friends. It's the most natural thing possible. right? If you want to be an influence for the gospel, just become somebody's friend without conditions. Just not even seeing somebody as a project, but just be their friend. Have them over for dinner. Go hang out, get coffee. Bless them, bring them coffee. Coffee's a theme here, right? Because it's the most important substance in America. But just be their friend. That's not difficult. If you want to be somebody who shares the gospel, just befriend people that don't know Jesus. And then allow the gospel to transfer from your life to theirs. Now, I think sometimes we get hung up with this because we just hope that we don't have to say anything if we're going to do that. But it seems that Daniel and the king had a relationship to the extent that Daniel actually talked about his God with his king. And so the king's able now here to actually say, may the God that you constantly serve deliver you, because he knows about that God. So this is something that's harder for us as Christians to move beyond just being people who are good, normal people, to actually then invite people to walk with God with us. But here's something you need to know about Christianity. People never become Christians because they know a super cool Christian. Because deep within us, there's something weird about being a Christian. You know what that thing is? Is that we think that the world has a lot of invisible pieces that you can't see. And that we serve a God who died and then rose again. Like, that's never going to be cool enough to get anybody to be like, I want to follow that. Just on its own merit, unless it's true. The other thing that is important is that what I find over and over again is that people are looking for significance. And Christians have the most significant reality that has changed our life buried deep within us. And if we bring that to the forefront, then others are able to see that as well and are able to be brought into it. But it must be revealed. It's not just something that's just caught. It must be shown through the way that you live your life, but also through what you say. So I find sometimes that churches try to figure out how to grow their churches, or people try to reach other people for Jesus. And so people try to have like really cool music and cool graphics and hip dressed pastors, which I am definitely not. And they try to like do these things so that people will come. But one of my colleagues, a guy named Dean and Sarah, says this. He says, listen, people never come because of those things. They only come on the arm of a friend. People come because somebody knows them and loves them and shares what's really going on within them. And that's what you see Daniel modeling right here. The king experiences the gospel through the vessel of Daniel. And it's in Daniel's hardest, darkest day that he sees the most work being done. Sometimes Christians, we try to act like everything's going so great that we become plastic and people can't see the gospel within us. But when we just open up and show people our struggles and how Jesus is better, the gospel is revealed through our heart and our life to our friends and our colleagues because of what Christ has done in us. And now you find the last thing that we see here in this text. The next morning, the king gets up. It says this, then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continuously, been able to deliver you from the mouth of lions? The king runs to the place where the lions are, and he's just like, are you there? Has God saved you? And Daniel says this, verse 21. It says, Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Daniel calls back, says, no, I'm still alive. God has saved me and rescued me. And here what you find Daniel doing is not just declaring like, hey, I'm still here, please get me out, right? Which is what I would be doing. I mean, it's cool and all the lions didn't eat me, but they might change their mind. So please get me out. No, what Daniel is doing is he's teaching the king about how to see the world. You see, he could have been like, yeah, no, king, I did this because I'm really good at like lion taming, and they didn't get me. Could have taken the credit. He could have said a lot of things, but what he does do is he says, no, God's the one that saved me. And in this moment, he helps the king understand the world through the lens of the gospel. So this is what we should do. We should be people who help our friends understand the world through the lens of the gospel. See, this is the last piece what I was kind of telling you about. It's like when you're in that time where you're struggling and they're asking like, how are you getting through this? What is God doing in this? How are you struggling through this? You can say it's not because I'm brave or smart or because I have it all figured out or I'm just like really just a person who's just zen all the time. No, you say it's because Jesus is here with me and he is the hope that I have. I got a chance to visit a friend of mine in the hospital this week. His son was in a coma for 5 days. They'd been in the hospital for 14 days. And I went and talked to him just because my heart was so burdened for my friend Eric. And we met. And he was telling me about his son and how he hasn't been able to see any reaction from him in days. But it was so amazing to see my friend's faith as he said, you know what, though? We just believe that my son Caleb is God's. And he can take him at any time. And whether he takes him or he leaves him, he's always going to be God's, and we're going to trust God in the middle of all of this. That is somebody who's just modeling that. To just say, listen, it's hard. We don't know what's going to happen. We're going to trust that God is better in the middle of this moment. So we prayed that God would heal Caleb, but mostly that God would be glorified through the life of Eric and his friends and through the people that are there. And the craziest thing was that a couple hours later, he woke up. Now, it could be like, wow, that's coincidence. It probably was. But what we do know is that God was doing something in the story. And as we look at stories like this, as God heals and saves and moves in people's lives, what's most important is that as we tell the story, that Christ becomes the central figure in it. He's the hope. He's the one that we're putting our hope and our confidence in. And Daniel does that here. Because he sees himself as someone who's on display for the gospel, not just for his own story. And so our story ends with this. Verse 25 says, the king was exceedingly glad, commanded Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and the men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke their bones in pieces. Now, that is just like not in the kid's story, all right? So let's just be faithful to the text and say what's going on there. Because you may be like, okay, I was tracking with this God, and then like there was like mass like families getting eaten by lions. Like what is that? Well, I think it's important for us as we kind of look at this text to remember this is a historical account. And it's not something that God is giving a stamp of approval of. Like, this is a pagan king who's in process, who executes judgment on people who were looking to change and influence his government in unfair ways. This is like really hard to read, but it's important to realize that God's not saying, amen, eat them up, lions. It's simply stating the fact of what happened. And yet, we find that in this story, there is a pointing towards the ultimate destiny of those who oppose God. That all of us, at some point, will face judgment for our sins. So there's an echo of that here as we look at this to realize, like, we need to be people who are playing for keeps about the worship and glory of God, because at some point, there will be judgment that will come against us. I believe that's one of the reasons why this is still included in this text. But the ultimate point of all this is the name and the glory of God. And that's what you find here last in verse 25. You find this king writing something about who God really is. It says, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered through the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You find Daniel changing his community so that an edict goes out to the whole nation that there's just one God. One person can save and change a community. One person can do that. And here's the thing that's so amazing about Daniel, is that Daniel pales in comparison to you. Because Daniel's just a picture of what Christ really did. Jesus is a better Daniel than Daniel ever was. Because here's what happens between the two. They both have similarities. They both go to their apparent death because of their allegiance to God. They both are placed in a place where there's a stone that covers. But the difference is that Jesus really died and Daniel did not. And Daniel was rescued so that people would glorify God, and that happened with Jesus as well. But Jesus actually rescues the enemies that were thrown through the lions. Jesus makes it possible for the enemies of God to become his friends. And Daniel, they simply get what they deserve, but in Jesus, they find out something different that they can't deserve. And so if we really believe this, then we are compelled to go proclaim this. See, I think one of the reasons why we struggle the most with sharing the gospel with our friends is not because we don't understand how to evangelize. Because we're really good at evangelizing. Things that we like a restaurant, we're like, man, listen, you got to check out this place. It's awesome. They got wood-fired pizza ovens from, they brought them from like Italy. You need to go. When you hear a cool song, and you're like, oh man, Taylor Swift dropped this thing. It was weird, but you need to listen to it. We do it, right? You find that sick worship song, you're like, man, that song is awesome. And send it to my friends on my new Apple app that I can do that with. I did that this week. We're good at evangelizing. The question is, are we good about doing it with Jesus? Because I think sometimes we're scared that we're going to get rejected. Because we're not sure if it really matters. But playing for keeps, believing that every single one of us has an allotted amount of time here to glorify God, that we have a certain amount of days, and God has given us those days for his name and renown, ought to compel us to tell people about the hope that we have. If Christ is the most important thing to our life, and he's the most important person in our life, and we've committed our life to follow him, we must proclaim him. We must. Otherwise, Christianity is like the worst hobby ever. Right? But if Christ is central, then it's the best experience we could ever imagine. And if you want to see God really move in your life, just tell other people about Jesus and the hope that you have. Because he is the most important reality that you can enter into and engage with, because he truly will love you in a way that you cannot be loved in any other way, with any other relationship, and any other experience. So we're going to close. I'm going to invite the band to come up. And we selected the song for you today to just declare this, to say Christ is the centerpiece of my hope and my life. So this is a time of response for us to just say, listen, I want Jesus. I want other people to know Jesus. I want my life to count. At the beginning of this year, this is something that's important. I know this is distracting, but just look at me for just a second, okay? Let's just acknowledge that it's weird that are coming up, right? Just look at me for just a second. At the beginning of this year, we said this. If each one of us just said, I want to bring one person to Christ this year, we said we could change the city. We said this. We were like, who is your one? Who's the one person that you're going to start praying? Christ, use me to influence this person for eternity. The reason we said just one person is because, man, sometimes we just hear this and we go, well, it must be like 100 people, or I'm a failure, because we're like hard-charging Americans. But honestly, if every single one of us did that this year, and then we did it next year, and then we did it the next year, then in the next year, then everybody in Nashville will know Jesus. It's just exponential growth. But it just starts by aiming really small, by just saying, God, let me be light to my community so that my friend could come with me to Christ. And wouldn't it be amazing for you to see somebody know Christ, have their life transformed by Jesus, and you even be a part of seeing them get baptized and see them grow in their faith and see them starting to do the same with other people? That would be an amazing opportunity. So as we're looking towards the end of the year, I know it's October, like Christmas is coming. What would it look like for us to be people who just say, listen, as we close out the year, can we just be people who reflect the glory of God among the people around us so that others can have the same hope that we have? Let's pray. Jesus, I just pray as a community that we would be people who love our neighbor, that we would be people who love them by meeting their relational needs, maybe even their financial needs, but most importantly, that we would meet their spiritual need through you, that we would introduce them to a friend that has changed us. And we would do that because we've been compelled by the reality that all of this is soon going to come to an end and you're going to come and make things right. But we want our friends to join us in that. So God, I pray that you would impress on us this urgency for the gospel. For those of us in this room, there are people in this room probably who have never truly trusted Christ. They're like, man, I'm 98% in, or I'm 75% in, or I'm in unless you're going to tell me to go to Iraq or someplace I don't like. But Jesus, you've called us to just say, we are in. You're King. We serve you. And we're going to go wherever you want us to go. And you have all of me. And I pray that that would be true for us as a community. In your name, Jesus, amen.